So Neil, welcome, and I guess goodbye to Boston. We're on our last day here
Yes.
on the campus of MIT. Sitting here in Cambridge, kind of an interesting place, sort of a center of innovation.
Hmm.
Very old institution, MIT. Some weird feeling, being here a little bit in the sort of the middle of where you feel things happen,
Oh,
right?
yes.
So welcome. My first question, my only question that I ever planned to ask is, who is Neil Crumpton?
Well, first of all, great to be here. So thank you, and thank you for a great few days. Who's Neil Crumpton? I've actually never been asked that before. So I'd say I'm a husband, I'm a servant leader, I'm an adventurer, an outdoorsman, um, and yeah, a nice British person living in Chicago.
A nice British person living in Chicago. That sounds like a Sting song because I think it is. But adventurer, tell me about adventurer Neil.
Yeah, so it started at a young age. My parents would always take me overseas on vacations, and that was a bug that stayed with me. Between my school and university, traveled for 6 months around Africa, got stuck on the border of South Africa, waiting for elections to go through, and just loved that ability to travel, to explore the world, to see different cultures, and to understand that I'm just a small person in a very large world.
Why is it important to travel and experience different cultures?
Um, I personally find it absolutely amazing. I've always had that breadth, I'll call it, and it's in part from living in a small country like Britain. We always claim to be sort of Great Britain, but it's a small country. And if I wanted to go skiing, I had to go to a different country. If I wanted to go to a beach, I had to go to a different country. I wanted to go into the mountains, pretty much had to go to a different country. So I had no choice, or at least I felt that way. And that ability to get out of my comfort zone, to travel, to explore, to be comfortable in countries where I couldn't speak the language, um, made me happy. It made me see that I was part of something bigger, as opposed to just being sort of focused on myself, where I am, and living in that comfort of just not traveling, not exploring, not understanding that bigger scope.
Do you think that because you lived in England, I mean you're from London,
Hmm.
in Chicago now, as you
Yep.
said, but do you think because you grew up in an environment that I do think, and I think it's still true today as it was 20, 30 years ago, it is almost expected that you travel when you're in sort of the European theater,
Hmm.
right? Countries are fairly close together. Wonderful transportation system
Yep.
compared to other parts of the world. The train system, especially in the connected countries, is amazing.
Hmm.
Do you think that gave you an advantage to travel?
I would say yes, because to your point, it's very well connected. The flights can be ridiculously cheap, like a couple of dollars to go to a different country, which in the US I've just never seen before. So they built a culture, a society that embraces that. I also think it's just through the history of Europe as a whole. Like it's just kind of bred into us to travel, to explore, and that it's part of you living there is just to get out of your own country, and experience other countries as well. I think with the US, and actually we talked about this last night with a colleague. There's that same level of travel, but the US is so vast, you don't actually need to leave the country.
Right.
I'm kind of jealous to a certain extent. Like in Chicago, if I want to go skiing, I can go out to Colorado, California, other places. If I want to go to the beaches, there's Florida. If I want to go to the mountains, huge choices. So there's still the travel involved, but it's within country, and in part because the country is so vast, but also slightly separated as well from the rest of the world geographically,
Yeah,
which makes it
it's
complex.
a real challenge. I mean, I born and raised, in America. I've always found, to your point, that traveling. I remember the first time I traveled, and I knew I was going to a country that didn't speak English, but it never really connected for me till I got there. And language is one of those things where it's immediate. You either know it or you don't. And I felt like I grew up in I was a military brat. So I had lived in 3 different countries, all English favorable, we'll say. And 14 different states in the United States. And so I'd been around, so I was used to travel. But the first time I went to a country that really didn't speak my language, and I remember going to, I went to Spain, went to Barcelona in my teens. And while there were many English speakers, clearly not, they're speaking, Spanish. And I was really out of my element. And I thought I was okay. Can you remember a time, when you were younger, even with the cultural expectation and the availability to travel, where you were in a situation where I really don't know this culture. I thought I did. I thought I was going to be able to communicate, because it's a big thing for human beings to communicate.
Yeah.
That fish out of water is alarming. Do you remember a time when when it was like that for you?
I do. In fact, I've got many experiences. As I mentioned, I traveled around Africa, spent about 6 months traveling around. And the moment I landed, it was obvious that I was somewhere different. This was early 90s. I was in Kenya, and the moment I land, you can tell that this is a different country, different language. But I would say that, and this is where it's almost this juxtaposition of myself, I was forced to learn languages at a young age. At age 6, 7, I was forced to start learning Latin.
Classic language.
Classic language, also a dead language
Yeah.
as well, and pretty difficult to learn. And unfortunately for me, that created this distaste to learn languages. And it was only at age 16 where I could actually start choosing the subjects that I wanted to learn. But having said that, when I went to Africa, I wanted to learn some of the language. I didn't want to be necessarily that fish out of water. And I felt that going into a new culture, as much as it would be like me, in a totally different environment, just knowing a few things would make a difference. So, I learned the language there. The same when I went into South Africa, learned some of the language. Same for Greece, same for Turkey. And I found it to be hugely beneficial. People will recognize straight away, even if you try to speak their language, that it's the foreign accent that comes through.
Sure.
But they really do appreciate the fact that you've made
tried.
an effort. You've tried. And even then, especially I remember in France, my French isn't great. I will speak in French, or at least try to. They'll immediately respond to me in English. They spot the accent straight away, but they recognize that I made an effort.
I think France is certainly one of those countries. I've had very, very similar experiences. I took my children, you and I were together in Rotterdam, and after that we went to Paris, because I was speaking at an event in Paris, and I had my whole family with me, this past June. And going into Paris, I taught my children, who were 5 and 8, just some of the basics of the French language, and just understanding that you're not trying to become French. I'll never be French. I am who I am. But assimilation is a part of understanding other cultures, and that's actually a really good thing. And I would agree with you, but I think the French are a little bit more vocal about assimilation. And to the opposite of that, if you go in and you're just hard speaking English, for example, with no effort whatsoever, to try to understand, speaking in French, even the basics, right? It's viewed negatively.
Oh yeah.
Right? And is it that way in many other countries where they can tell you're just not even trying?
I'm sure it is. I haven't experienced it.
The French are a bit open about that.
They're very national proud.
Yes.
And I admire them for that.
Yeah.
I think to a large extent the English are as well. But the English have the luxury of there being a broad population that speaks the same language. it was almost these running jokes on TV as a child that if someone speaks a foreign language, you just carry on speaking English. If they don't understand you first time, just speak louder and more slowly,
Right.
and they'll eventually get it.
Right.
And that was sort of the basis of some comedy. But to a certain extent, that's how the English sort of approach it, or at least used to. That everyone must speak English, and therefore we can go in anywhere, we can speak our language, and of course everyone's going to know, which is fundamentally wrong, obviously. But there is that little bit of nationalism, and I'm pleased to at least see that over the years that's quietened down. People make the efforts.
How is that? So that attitude of learning new cultures, which I think is incredibly important to just make you more worldly. How has that helped you in your job day to day? Now, you're a recruiter by profession.
Yes.
Deep in your heart, even though you're a leader, you're an executive, you're leading teams at this point. But a recruiter at heart, that's a pretty important quality. So how is that approach to being more global, more worldview, helped you in your day to day?
Yeah, so I've been, I guess you could say, fortunate, although in hindsight, I was given a lot of responsibility at too young an age. So my background is executive recruiting. At a very young age, I went into executive recruiting. I was very quickly doing global searches from London. I had to quickly understand like the provincial system in China, understand all the nuances of the laws across Europe, understand the expat community, and how to tap into that in Africa. Did a search in Burkina Faso at one point, which most people haven't even heard of.
I'm not even sure where that is.
They have an airline, or at least they did, Air Burkina, and hopefully a very good CEO still. But that gave me that exposure to these different cultures, having to understand, having to be able to interact, to leverage language. I still remember it right now, and anyone who's German, I'll apologize, but Unternehmensberatung, management consulting. It's like that's I had to pick up these things to try and get through sort of the receptionist, the assistant, to get through to the people I needed to speak to, and to know the language, to understand the culture, and interact with them. I found hugely helpful. I'd say on the flip side, and I mentioned I was given a lot of responsibility at a young age. Like at age 23, 24, I was leading a team of researchers across Europe. And in hindsight, I was way too young to be doing that. Learning by fire is probably the best way to describe it. But the one thing I embraced was the fact, like, I had a researcher in Sweden, I had a researcher in the Netherlands, I had a researcher in Germany, a team in London. And I had to bring them together. I had to make them sort of interact, work cohesively, and make sure that there was that peer-to-peer relationship as well. So it's that sort of way it is, where you're sort of understanding the cultures, the environment, the ways of working in different countries, and just finding those common grounds amongst your team so they can be productive and embrace each other, work together.
So just learning the cultures. I mean, just from a team makeup perspective, you're automatically, you have this eye for what's going to work for a certain person based on the culture that they're in, but also how do you get them connected, right? Mm-hmm. So you mentioned being in executive search. I think I would love to know what makes executives tick. Is there a common trait, like especially when you're talking about moving executives around, between companies? These are very high level positions with a massive responsibility. What is your advice to those that are interacting with executives in terms of their own personality traits? Like what are the commonalities that you see in leaders?
Yeah, so I'll start by saying that the obvious one is they're all humans. I quickly learnt, and actually it's one of my mentors sort of guided me, that they're still human. Like, they still go home at the end of the day, they have families, they have outside experiences, activities, interests. These are people that might feel inaccessible, but they're available. and they're happy to chat. So don't put them up on that mantle. Don't be afraid of them. Don't be nervous about them. They're still human. They're still going to have the car issue. They're still going to have things that they need to do at the weekends, just like everyone else. They're not these sort of gods, if you will, of people.
Why do you think people, especially if you're young coming into, the professional world, and may not have a ton of experience, I think we tend to, and rightly so, we'll give an executive, a leader, at least a modicum of credit for how they got there and the responsibility they have. Sometimes it's not easy to put that aside. Is that our own ego, just the sort of the fear of saying the wrong thing, right, or being perceived? I have, I think part of it is also you don't get a ton of exposure, especially if you are layers, removed in an organization from a leader, and you might meet them in an elevator, and some people freeze up. I don't want to say the wrong thing. Other people, dive in, but how do you approach a situation like that? That's probably a really good analogy too, or sort of narrative. Like you're meeting an executive in your company in the elevator, what do you say?
Good morning, good afternoon is the thing.
Right.
Yeah, how are you?
Forgetting to be polite,
yeah.
right? It's just the basics.
Yeah. I mean, in England, I always joke in England, you always talk about the weather. People love that. It's something that's common. It's universal around the world, and everyone has an opinion on it. Like it's snowing today for us.
Today in Boston, yeah.
But I think it's to one of your earlier points. I think as humans, like we tend to put these people, at sort of this distance because there's a lot of admiration. There might be some people that are jealous of the level they've got to, and for the average person, it's hard to connect with that individual because you're seeing them so many steps beyond where you are in your career or your point of life. That you struggle to see yourself getting there quite often, and therefore you create this this metaphoric distance between yourself and them, and you stop thinking about them just being a human, someone who's just got up at 5, 6 o'clock in the morning, someone that also might have gone for a run in the morning, the same time as you, might have even been running just in front of you, but we don't think about these things. We just see them quite often with that title. And then suddenly our mind starts going crazy around the fact of, well, I don't want to say anything to them. I don't want to embarrass myself. I don't know what to say to them. What are they thinking about? What would they want me to say to them? Okay. Like we put all these sort of barriers in place. Our minds go quite often crazy. And we forget the basics, like, hi, how are you doing?
I remember being, obviously a young up-and-coming professional, and I remember being in that specific situation on the elevator with the CEO of the company, who I'd never met, in a 20,000 person organization, and I froze up because I was so afraid to say the wrong thing, and I didn't say anything, and I wound up meeting him a few months later, and he said to me, I remember you and I didn't really meet each other, but we were on an elevator together. Here's the other thing that I have found with executives, almost to the point, is they remember in a positive way, right? They're in that position because they're so observant of their surroundings, and they're so unafraid, to engage in a conversation, not worried about saying the wrong thing. We're just talking. Yeah. There's no expectation, and I think that's what a lot of people do is. They freeze because they put an expectation on this conversation. At the end of this conversation, Neil's going to know my name. He's going to love me, and he's going to walk upstairs and go, wow, I met this really great guy in the elevator, right? None of that is going to happen. It's just a couple of people sharing an elevator, and you might as well just say hi.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, and again, I'm going to age myself a little bit, but with technology, the .com boom, it created a different type of leader. I mean, I've worked at some global companies, and there was obviously a conscious decision by these companies to put their executives on the top floor, limited access. I worked at another company where you had to have special access to get into the executive area. And when I was leading their executive recruiting, every 3 months, I had to renew my access and to get that approval to be just even allowed into the same area as them. That's changed now. I see it a lot. I mean, my company today, we've got the executive team, and they're fully accessible. There are no doors blocking people from walking up to their office, knocking on their door. They're in the same size offices as everyone else. So totally accessible. And I think that's part of the evolution that I've seen in the US. I've seen it elsewhere, about trying to humanize these individuals, trying to make them accessible, and for the people that work with them to see that, to embrace that, and to embrace that level of culture that the company has. So I think it's fantastic that the old days of like the mahogany walled, executive
the executive
suites,
bathroom,
the executive lounge, executive dining room, all this. I hope that that's a dinosaur that's now extinct, because I don't think it helps.
Do you think some of that has been driven by Gen Z, millennial, just saying this is not the world that we want to operate in? It goes back to maybe a little bit of, it's analogous to traveling the world, right? Mm-hmm. I want to be able to go where I want to go, respectfully, of course, right? Assimilate to a culture, and the leadership is a culture in itself, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and it has been a secretive culture. For you and I, we're that age where, to your point, it was that club.
Yeah.
Right? And you weren't getting in that club unless you had the title to get into the club. And that is it still exists in some places, but it is pretty much falling away at this point. And I do think a lot of it's driven by these new generations coming in saying, no, we're not going to work that way.
Yeah.
Do you see that in your everyday work with, and I'm sure you have, some young people on your team, mm-hmm. They work differently. And the expectation is far different. It's like, no, you're going to give me this information. You expect me to do this job. I need access. I need this information. So what I've seen is sort of a breaking down of these walls, these barriers that you and I faced. Mm-hmm. So Gen Xers with the baby boom generation, where leaders really isolated themselves. Yeah. For what strange reasons that we think, but that's also how they grew up. I mean, if you think about how baby boomers grew up, coming from military families, right? Dad came home from the war, and this was the sort of military structure, and you didn't talk to the officers, they mm-hmm. talked to you.
Yep.
And that sort of permeated that culture. How is Gen Z and the millennial cultures, how has that been clashing with our culture and sort of leading that change and saying, no, we have to have access. If you expect us to do this kind of work, you expect us to be the next generation that's going to take over, you have to give us access to your knowledge, and leaders. Yeah. What have you observed in that?
Yeah, I've seen today's leaders are humanized. We see them in social media all the time. We see them sort of on the stage, and we see them as humans. And they've got voracious learners, subject matter experts, quite often born leaders. But we see them for who they are. We see them as humans, and I think through generations that are coming through, they've embraced that. They also then see these people as accessible, as human. My hope is that the generations nowadays don't have those preconceptions that I'd say that I used to have, that our generation used to have, of putting these people on mantles as I wouldn't necessarily say gods, but as inaccessible individuals. And through that, they understand, and they want to quite often to get to that level. They want to have access to those people. They want to learn from them. And by and large, our leaders are understanding of that, and they embrace it, which is great. I've worked for several companies, and there's always been a point from even some of those companies where The executives have been behind those locked doors. Even in those environments, they still knew they had to get the executives in front of the young leaders. And we still do that today. Like our CEO sits down with interns. Our CEO will say, like, if you want to have a chat with me at any point, come up, just knock on my window, open the door or walk in. And he truly means it, which I think is fantastic. And it creates that open environment which allows people the access, allows them the comfort, allows them to ask questions of the leaders, to seek input, and to really sort of expand their career journey. That it's no longer a case of like, I've just got to be doing everything I can for my boss because he's the one who's going to control my career. That they easily see, understand, and I give nothing but admiration because I didn't sort of have this scope as a young kid. But they see the value of getting that broad network, not just focusing on that near term, like if I have a great relationship with my boss, I'm going to get that promotion. And then I just need a great relationship with the next boss, then I'm going to get that promotion.
The constant ladder climbing. We talk about this quite often, because we're in recruiting and we're in talent management. That careers now are very much like rock walls versus a ladder.
Yeah.
And the individual, giving them agency to control. I want to go up. Sometimes, I've actually moved down in my career to move up, to move sideways, depending on life choices and situations and all those things. And I think when you have the freedom to know that you've got an organization that supports that level of sort of omnidirectional movement, in my career path, it's so much more satisfying. It opens up so many more options, and people tend to stay in organizations that operate that way versus the older way. So
yeah,
I think that's important to know. I have one other question for you. I said I didn't have too many prepared questions, and I lied completely. So I must be a good poker player. But somebody told me a story in the last 24 hours and said, you have to ask Neil this question. And the question is this. Tell me the story about dancing on tables with famous people.
That one got out. Okay, yes.
Pretty quick.
Should have stayed quiet, shouldn't I? So yes. So after having sort of, I'd say, a career in executive search at one of the major consultancies, I decided to get out. Loved the thrill of the hunt of finding candidates. Hated the sale of trying to find the business. So I got out of executive recruiting, at least from the agency side, and got pulled into private equity. So it was a great experience and a great education for me, learning around the world of private equity, sort of the work hard environment. There was no play hard there at all. It was all about just working hard. But I was fortunate to work with some great leaders there, to get exposure to some of those companies that we'd worked with. And one of those companies, I won't name names for the sake of this, but one of those companies, we had a CEO that we worked very closely with. We built out his executive team at a couple of companies, actually helped him build his sales team. And I'd also say that I've got nothing but admiration for him. We talked about it earlier about leaders being available. So quick side note, this is a CEO who is so passionate about the success of his business, he put his desk in the middle of the sales room. And at any point, if someone felt that they were losing a sale on the phone, they'd hold up their hand and the CEO would come over, join the call, and try and get the sale for that one item. And that was how passionate he was about his business, which I thought was amazing. Absolutely amazing. Like, he put himself in that metaphoric bullpen, fully accessible, and for him, every single sale mattered, and he was there, he was available to do it. He was someone who also had sort of a pretty lively external lifestyle as well, or out of work lifestyle. And as a leadership team, we went out one evening, went to dinner at a great Japanese restaurant. There was a nightclub pretty much underneath. And so we went down to the nightclub. And before I knew it, everyone is on tables dancing. We had like a little VIP area. Some music came on. He loved it and got everyone up, got everyone dancing. And I think for the next hour or 2 hours, like everyone just kept on going. Like it was impressive. And people were doing this because they wanted to. And because of the enjoyment they were gaining from it, as opposed to feeling that they had to because of this person's stature. So it's one of those memories that I still joke about with people. Not too often, so I'm surprised it got to you. But a great memory.
Good deal. So, Neil, thank you for sharing your story. A little bit of a culture warrior, cultural explorer, adventurer, and I appreciate you sharing time with us.
No, thank you for this. I hope this is the first of hopefully several if I'm invited back.
You will. Thanks, Neil.
No problem. Thanks a lot.